When General George S. Patton died in 1945, the French government, still dizzy with gratitude for its latest liberation, offered him a gesture that bordered on sacrilege. They proposed to bury the brash American general beside Napoleon Bonaparte in Les Invalides, the grand cathedral of French militarism. The suggestion was both magnificent and absurd. One conqueror of Europe offering eternal companionship to another who had arrived a century too late to seize it. It was not an empty offer. The dome of Les Invalides is France's temple to martial vanity, its golden roof gleaming like an apotheosis of ego. Beneath it lies Napoleon, surrounded by his marshals, a few relatives, and the ghosts of ambition itself. To invite a foreigner, an American no less, to rest there was to breach centuries of national exclusivity. No foreign soldier had ever been interred within its marble womb. It was a gesture of gratitude so extravagant it bordered on theatrical repentance. But the offer was declined. Patton's widow, Beatrice, chose instead to have him buried in Luxembourg, among the men of his Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge. He should lie beside his men, she said, an answer that, though sentimental, saved France the embarrassment of having to enshrine a man whose virtues, like Napoleon's, came intertwined with mania. Had Patton accepted the French invitation, or, more accurately, had he lived to do so, it would have been a symbolic reunion between two men born centuries apart but cut from the same cloth. Mercurial, messianic, and unfit for peacetime. Each believed himself chosen. Napoleon by destiny, Patton by reincarnation. Each saw history not as a slow accumulation of institutions, but as a stage for personal glory. Their monuments were not built to honor nations, but to immortalize their own reflections. Les Invalides began, ironically, as a hospice. Louis XIV ordered it constructed in the 17th century for wounded veterans, an early attempt at state-sponsored mercy. Over time, mercy gave way to marble, and the building transformed from a sanctuary for the broken into a shrine for the victorious. By the time Napoleon's remains were brought back from St. Helena in 1840, the place had become an architectural boast. The Republic and the Empire had merged their symbols into one glittering absurdity, a cathedral that worshipped war under the pretense of honoring peace. Napoleon's tomb itself is not modest. It looms beneath a dome that commands reverence from the unwilling. His sarcophagus is enormous, circular, and placed in a pit, so that visitors must bow to see it. It is a masterpiece of psychological architecture. Even in death, the emperor forces his admirers to look down upon him while feeling smaller for the privilege. To place Patton there would have been fitting in the most unsettling sense. He too understood that war is theater, and that soldiers are both actors and props. His pearl-handled revolvers were not a necessity, but a costume. His profanity-laced speeches less about morale than myth-making. He wanted his men to fear him as much as the enemy did. It worked. The Germans regarded him as the Allies' most dangerous commander, not because of his strategy, though that was formidable, but because he seemed to enjoy the killing. The French, in their periodic spasms of romantic gratitude toward the Americans, have a curious habit of choosing their symbols badly. Lafayette they embraced because he flattered their revolutionary self-image. Patton they honored because he reminded them that history had not entirely extinguished their taste for martial swagger. The gesture to bury him beside Napoleon was less about Patton's accomplishments and more about France's yearning to borrow a bit of borrowed greatness. An attempt to reassert the illusion that the French and the Americans shared the same heroic lineage, the same defiance, the same disdain for cautious diplomacy. It was, of course, nonsense. France's relationship with America has always been a comedy of mutual misreading. The Americans imagine the French as effete aesthetes, hopelessly intellectual and morally fickle. The French, for their part, see in Americans a peculiar barbarism wrapped in optimism, a people who industrialized heroism and called it democracy. The offer to enshrine Patton among France's sacred dead was thus a kind of diplomatic theater, a gesture of flattery meant to disguise the lingering resentment that liberation always brings. Gratitude, after all, is a form of humiliation. France's pride required that its liberator be recast not as conqueror, but as brother in arms. That gesture also revealed something more, a shared myth of righteous violence. Both France and America have long cultivated the idea that war, when conducted by the right men for the right ideals, purifies rather than corrupts. Napoleon and Patton were the most potent embodiments of this delusion. They treated battle not as tragedy, but as vocation, a moral crucible in which greatness could be forged. Their speeches glorified courage while masking cruelty, turning slaughter into ceremony. The French loved Napoleon for giving them grandeur. Americans loved Patton for giving them victory. Both nations confused success with sanctity. Yet the two men were products of very different worlds. Napoleon rose from the ashes of a revolution that had devoured its own children. Patton emerged from a republic that industrialized its wars and wrapped its conquests in moral packaging. The emperor crowned himself in a cathedral. The general crowned himself in the imagination of Hollywood. Each believed that Providence had placed them above mediocrity. Each was correct, and each was damned by it. Patton's belief in reincarnation was not a passing eccentricity. He was convinced that he had fought at Thermopylae, led legions under Caesar, and stood beside Napoleon himself. His diaries read less like those of a general and more like the ravings of a mystic obsessed with his own immortality. The irony is exquisite. A man who saw himself as the eternal warrior ended his life immobilized in a car crash, killed not by an enemy, but by the banal mechanics of peacetime. France, ever the nation of contradictions, saw in that death an opportunity for symbolism. The offer to bury him beside Napoleon was both a tribute and a trap, a way to fold his restless legend into theirs, to neutralize his swagger beneath the weight of French marble. It would have made him, quite literally, another relic of the empire. But Patton would have hated it. For all his vanity, he despised the stillness of memorials. He wanted movement, noise, applause, the theater of command, not the silence of commemoration. His widow understood this when she chose Luxembourg. Among his men, surrounded by the unremarkable dead, Patton's ego could finally perform its last paradox: humility by association. One cannot help but notice the difference between Napoleon's tomb and the American cemeteries scattered across Europe. The former is an edifice to one man's ambition. The latter are fields of anonymous crosses, democratic even in death. The French entombed their emperor in imperial splendor. The Americans buried their general among the ranks. Yet even this contrast deceives. The American cult of the individual hero is no less elaborate. It simply prefers the rhetoric of modesty. Patton's myth lives not in stone, but in cinema. In the thundering monologues of George C. Scott. In the endless repetition of that immortal line, "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his." That aphorism, repeated by generations of soldiers who admire its crude efficiency, perfectly captures the American gospel of war. Victory as virtue, death as poor planning, and morality as something best left to the chaplain. France builds cathedrals for its conquerors. America builds movie sets. Both worship the same God. They simply differ on the style of altar. It is remarkable how quickly nations forget the less flattering aspects of their heroes. The French remember Napoleon's code, but not his wars of attrition. Americans celebrate Patton's daring, but not his cruelty. The French forgive their emperor for restoring slavery in the colonies. Americans forgive their general for calling Holocaust survivors lower than animals. Both societies possess an almost theological gift for selective memory. Great men, after all, are far easier to admire when they are conveniently dead. When the French offered to bury Patton in Paris, they were not honoring his character, they were canonizing his utility. Patton had helped rescue Europe from tyranny, and that made his sins negotiable. France could exalt him without consequence, just as America could later enshrine him in film without embarrassment. The result was a transatlantic consensus. Moral complexity is forgivable if it arrives wrapped in victory.
The American cemeteries across France remain immaculate. Lawns trimmed, marble crosses spotless, flags perpetually crisp in the wind. The French maintain them with almost religious precision, as if the purity of the grounds could atone for the chaos they commemorate. Visitors marvel at the tranquility, mistaking cleanliness for peace. In truth, those perfect lawns are a kind of denial, They erased the mud, the screams, the moral confusion of the liberation that saved France while destroying half of it. Patton, had he seen these sanctified acres, might have approved. He had little patience for subtlety. To him, war was not a moral dilemma, but a test of endurance. And endurance was virtue. His men worshipped him for it, even as they feared him. The Germans respected him, the French romanticized him, and the Americans mythologized him. 3 nations united by the delusion that a man who excelled at killing could also embody civilization. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere, in the metaphysical barracks where old generals pace for eternity, Napoleon and Patton are still arguing. 2 egos locked in immortal competition. The Corsican emperor boasts of Austerlitz. The Californian mystic counters with Bastogne. Napoleon quotes Roman law. Patton quotes his own press clippings. Both remain convinced that history misunderstood them. Neither ever learned the difference between greatness and consequence. France, in its moment of gratitude, nearly reunited them in stone. Perhaps it is just as well that it did not. The marble at Les Invalides already bears enough arrogance without adding another ghost to the echo chamber. Patton's proper place is among his soldiers, an equal at last, though surely still lecturing the silence about the virtues of aggression. The offer to bury Patton beside Napoleon reveals more about nations than about men. France, haunted by the memory of its defeats, sought to reassert the grandeur of its military lineage by adopting an American conqueror. America, eager to believe in its own nobility, found in Patton the perfect instrument of moral violence. Each projected its own fantasies onto the corpse of a soldier. Between them lies the uncomfortable truth that civilization has never quite decided whether it admires war for its necessity or for its spectacle. Patton's marble twin in Paris was never built, but the idea persists that history's monsters can be redeemed by victory, that ego is a substitute for vision, and that nations, like men, cannot resist the temptation to worship their own reflections in the polished surface of a tomb. History, when it grows sentimental, develops an irritating fondness for tyrants with good manners. Napoleon Bonaparte is the most enduring example of this phenomenon. A man who crowned himself emperor, consumed Europe in fire, and yet managed to die as a national treasure. 2 centuries later, he remains embalmed not only in Les Invalides, but in the French psyche, preserved by a mixture of pride and denial that would impress even his own propagandists. It is one of the great achievements of modern public relations, turning a warlord into a philosopher king and a despot into the symbol of enlightened progress. Napoleon's admirers insist that he was not merely a conqueror, but an architect of modernity. They point to his civil code, his administrative reforms, and his doctrine of meritocracy, as if these inventions somehow absolve his habit of burning down nations. France, after all, prefers its heroes efficient. The emperor gave the country order, bureaucracy, and the comforting illusion that despotism could be rational. His wars may have drowned the continent in blood, but at least the paperwork was impeccable. The mythology of Napoleon is built upon one of history's most successful acts of self-editing. The French remember him not as the man who waged ceaseless war, but as the statesman who codified law. They cite the Napoleonic Code as a monument to rational governance, a legal masterpiece that replaced the chaos of feudal decrees with the sleek machinery of modern civil law. It is, admittedly, an achievement, yet it was also the perfect reflection of its author. Precise, elegant, and utterly authoritarian. The code brought equality before the law, except for women, who were demoted to permanent minors under the supervision of their husbands. Liberty, equality, fraternity, so long as one did not belong to the wrong gender, class, or country. Still, France forgave him. It always does. The nation that guillotined its kings has a remarkable talent for recrowning them posthumously. Napoleon is excused on the grounds that he was necessary, a convenient euphemism that every dictatorship eventually employs. He is remembered not as the man who silenced the press and censored thought, but as the visionary who replaced aristocratic privilege with bureaucratic competence. It is as if the entire country collectively decided that tyranny is tolerable, provided it arrives with good handwriting. Across the Channel, the English developed a very different mythology. To them,
Napoleon was not a legislator, but the Antichrist in uniform, a usurper who threatened the balance of Europe and the sanctity of trade. British propaganda transformed him into a caricature of evil, a demonic pygmy, a Corsican ogre, a scourge of civilization. That he was, in many respects, a genius mattered little. What mattered was that he was not British. The empire that built its own dominion on global conquest found it convenient to label his ambitions aggression. Hypocrisy is the first language of imperial diplomacy. The Anglo-American world inherited this disdain. In English-speaking histories, Napoleon remains the archetypal villain, the man whose ego destroyed Europe and whose downfall confirmed the moral superiority of moderation. It is a comfortable story, and therefore a false one. For while Britain congratulated itself on defending liberty, it was simultaneously subjugating half the planet. The difference between British imperialism and Napoleon's continental empire was merely administrative. One ruled with ledgers, the other with bayonets. Patton, curiously, occupies the reverse position. Where Napoleon is demonized in English but adored in French, Patton is sanctified in English and viewed with wary amusement in France. The roles are inverted, the myths intact. Each nation forgives the brutality of its own conquerors while condemning the others. It is a sort of moral barter system. You may have your emperor if we may have our general. Thus, history maintains its equilibrium of hypocrisy. Napoleon's defenders often celebrate his supposed meritocracy, the idea that under his reign, talent replaced birthright, and soldiers could rise through skill rather than lineage. It is a pleasing narrative, especially for a republic that grew tired of guillotining its nobles. Yet even this revolutionary virtue carried its poison. Napoleon's meritocracy existed only within the narrow confines of his obedience. Advancement came not to the brilliant, but to the useful. Not to the courageous, but to the loyal. His marshals were chosen not merely for competence, but for devotion. And when their devotion wavered, he discarded them like so many worn-out sabers. The emperor's love of meritocracy ended precisely where his own authority began. Patton would have approved. He too believed in promotion through valor, preferably his own. His command style was less about empowering subordinates than ensuring that none shone brighter than he did. He demanded initiative, but punished deviation. Exalted courage, but despised weakness. Like Napoleon, he was both revolutionary and reactionary. He rejected mediocrity while worshipping hierarchy. His armies advanced not on ideology, but on adrenaline. Both men shared an obsession with speed. Napoleon's armies marched faster than any in history. Patton's tanks moved as if possessed. Motion, for them, was not merely a tactic, but a theology. To halt was to decay. To advance was to exist. Napoleon once said that battles are won by those who arrive first with the most men. Patton would have reduced the thought further. Battles are won by those who refuse to stop moving long enough to think. This mania for motion disguised a deeper fear, the terror of irrelevance. Both men were incapable of stillness because stillness implied the absence of purpose. Napoleon could not abide peace. Patton could not tolerate victory. The end of war left them exposed to the one enemy they could not outflank: ordinary life. Peace demanded reflection, and reflection demanded conscience. Neither man possessed the patience for it. Napoleon's empire was, in many ways, a prototype for the American one that followed a century later. Both were born in revolution and justified their expansion as a civilizing mission. Both cloaked conquest in the language of liberation. The French carried the rights of man to every nation they invaded. The Americans brought democracy. The results were identical: grateful corpses and suspicious allies. Empire, when practiced by the self-righteous, is always missionary in tone. The United States, like France, insists that its wars are expressions of moral duty rather than appetite. Patton embodied this delusion perfectly. He saw himself not as a conqueror, but as an agent of destiny, a soldier appointed by Providence to purge the world of tyranny. His disdain for the enemy was matched only by his contempt for hesitation. To him, diplomacy was cowardice dressed in paperwork, and restraint a form of treason. Had he lived, he would have launched the Third World War with the same enthusiasm he brought to crossing the Rhine. The French, having learned the cost of perpetual war, could at least admire in Patton the recklessness they once indulged in themselves. He was a mirror of their own imperial youth, a reminder of the days when France, too, mistook violence for virtue. Napoleon's greatest invention was not the Code Civil, but the myth of rational war, the idea that conflict, if conducted with precision and genius, could serve the progress of civilization. It was a comforting doctrine, especially for those who profited from it. Under its influence, the slaughter of millions became an administrative exercise. The chaos of war transformed into the elegance of strategy. The same delusion resurfaced in the 20th century, when mechanized armies replaced cavalry, and generals began to measure success in tonnage and fuel, rather than in principles. Patton was the perfect disciple of that school. He believed that aggression, properly organized, was a moral good. His genius lay not in invention, but in execution, the pure, unreflective energy of a man who mistook motion for meaning. Napoleon at least left behind architecture. Patton left behind doctrine. His theories of armored warfare became gospel in military academies, ensuring that the next century would continue to treat annihilation as a form of professionalism. The two men together built the template for the modern military hero. Brilliant, amoral, and indispensable during war, intolerable during peace. Every empire venerates the figure who embodies its contradictions. Napoleon's France worshipped equality, but adored hierarchy. Patton's America preached democracy, but exalted command. Each man became the living paradox his nation required, a moral alibi for the violence beneath its ideals. France needed an emperor who could make tyranny sound progressive. America needed a general who could make slaughter sound patriotic. Both performed admirably. That is why Napoleon remains in his golden tomb, while Patton's name adorns barracks and battleships. The world prefers its conquerors embalmed, its generals mythologized, and its atrocities politely edited. To question them is to question the foundation of national pride itself. Better than to speak of great men and necessary wars, and to leave the moral accounting to historians, too timid to balance the books. Napoleon's admirers often defend him on the grounds that he brought order to a chaotic world. Order is a seductive word, especially to those who benefit from it. But Napoleon's order was not peace, it was control. His Europe was organized not for prosperity, but for obedience. He restructured nations, imposed uniform laws, and redrew borders with the precision of a surveyor and the callousness of a god. The result was not harmony, but exhaustion. Patton's order was of a different kind, mechanical rather than administrative, but equally absolute. His armies operated like machines because he demanded that men become extensions of metal. A soldier, he declared, is a piece of the army, and must be trained to think and act as such. It was a sentiment worthy of the emperor himself. Both men believed that individual will, properly disciplined, could transform chaos into destiny, and both discovered that such transformation requires a level of brutality only the victorious can afford to forget. The continued fascination with these two figures says less about them than about us. We remain addicted to the spectacle of glory, unable to separate greatness from domination. Napoleon's victories and Patton's campaigns feed the same appetite that once drew crowds to the Colosseum. The uniforms have changed, the rhetoric refined, but the impulse remains primitive, to admire the man who bends the world to his will, regardless of the cost. France still reveres Napoleon because he turned humiliation into empire. America still celebrates Patton because he turned carnage into choreography. Their legends offer reassurance to nations uneasy with their own histories. If such men were great, then perhaps the wars they fought were necessary, and the blood they spilled, not waste, but sacrament.
Patton's conviction that he was the reincarnation of ancient warriors is more than a curiosity. It is an allegory. Every empire, in its moment of triumph, imagines itself the reincarnation of a greater one. Napoleon saw himself as Caesar reborn. Patton fancied himself Napoleon. The United States, inheriting the ashes of European empires, has never escaped this lineage.
It wages its crusades under the banner of democracy, just as France once did under the banner of liberty. The rhetoric changes. The theology persists. Civilization, it seems, requires its soldiers to believe in destiny. This is why both men remain irresistible to popular memory. They offer the intoxicating fantasy that history is not shaped by committees or commerce, but by individuals of volcanic will. In a world that now worships mediocrity, such myth-making feels almost romantic. Yet it is also dangerous, for it obscures the lesson that empires never die. They merely reincarnate in different uniforms. There is, of course, a price for this perpetual resurrection of greatness. Napoleon left France bankrupt and Europe mutilated. Patton left a trail of moral debris, soldiers broken, enemies dehumanized, and a new generation of officers convinced that audacity excuses everything. The French built marble monuments to justify their emperor. Americans built an entire military-industrial complex to justify theirs. Both nations paid for glory with conscience. And yet, remarkably, both continue to speak of their heroes with affection, as if history were a family album and atrocity a youthful indiscretion. The French still call Napoleon a genius. Americans still quote Patton at football games. The worship of victory is a habit that survives its own consequences. In the end, Napoleon and Patton are not two separate legends, but one continuous reflection, an eternal dialogue between ambition and justification. The emperor looks out from his sarcophagus of red porphyry. The general peers from black and white film reels. Each insists that his wars were necessary, his motives pure, his failures misunderstood. And each is believed, because nations prefer myth to memory. France and America, gazing into this shared mirror, see not two men, but themselves. Civilized, violent, idealistic, hypocritical. The reflection flatters them, which is why they never look away. George S. Patton's death in December 1945 came not amid the roar of tanks, but in the whimper of a motor accident on a German road. It was, by cosmic standards, an anticlimax. A man who had defied artillery, arrogance, and common sense alike was undone by the most mundane instrument of modernity, a sedan. The gods of war have always preferred irony. The French mourned him as the liberator who had restored their dignity. Americans wept for the general who had restored their confidence. Few paused to consider the other Patton, the one who, in his final months, was rapidly disintegrating into paranoia and bile. He had begun to see conspiracies in every corridor, and moral decay in every handshake. His journals dripped with anti-Semitic venom, his speeches with contempt for allies, and his patience with democracy itself had expired. He had become, in the words of one biographer, a cannon left loaded after the war. As military governor of Bavaria, Patton treated the defeated Germans with something bordering on affection. The Nazis, he confided to his wife, were the only decent people in Europe. Jews, conversely, were a stinking mass of humanity. He resisted orders to remove former party members from office, denounced denazification as a communist plot, and regarded displaced persons as a sanitary nuisance. To modern readers, this mixture of bigotry and delusion is revolting. To his contemporaries, it was merely inconvenient. He was relieved of command with minimal scandal, proof that in the mid-20th century, victory excused nearly everything except embarrassment. Patton's apologists often mutter that he was a man of his time, as though prejudice were an environmental hazard from which no one could be expected to remain uninfected. But Patton's virulence exceeded the norms of his era. He did not merely share the casual racism of a segregated army. He spiritualized it. His worldview divided humanity into the strong and the weak, the chosen and the expendable. It was the gospel of conquest, stripped of its patriotic varnish. A theology of domination masquerading as duty. He despised communists, pitied the Germans, loathed the Jews, and distrusted civilians. In short, he loved war because it eliminated the need to respect anyone. Had he survived, Patton would have been intolerable in peace. The post-war world required administrators. He remained an evangelist. The Truman administration preferred quiet men who understood budgets and press conferences, not prophets who spoke of destiny. Patton's obsession with confronting the Soviet Union, his conviction that America should finish the job and march to Moscow, was less a strategy than a nervous tic. He could not endure the stillness that followed victory. A life without enemies was, to him, a form of death. Fate spared Washington the trouble of retiring him, yet his death birthed a legend that life had already begun to tarnish. In absence, the inconvenient Patton, the racist, the insubordinate, the dangerous romantic, evaporated, leaving behind the marble silhouette of old blood and guts. Hollywood embalmed him in celluloid. Politicians quoted him at banquets. Cadets memorized his aphorisms as scripture. The general who might have become a national scandal became, through death, a national saint. America has always been more comfortable canonizing its soldiers than understanding them. Patton's posthumous sanctification revealed something profound about the American imagination. The nation that prided itself on pragmatism was secretly addicted to mysticism. The belief that destiny chooses certain men to embody its will. In Patton's reincarnation fantasies, America recognized its own. The conviction that it was not merely powerful, but preordained. His conviction that he had fought in every great battle since antiquity mirrored the country's conviction that it had inherited every virtue of civilization since Athens. Both delusions were flattering. Both excused everything. The French, watching this transformation, could only nod in recognition. They too had perfected the art of forgiving their conquerors once the statues were up and the memoirs published. Napoleon's France and Patton's America were, at heart, the same organism. Democracies that worship strong men, republics perpetually on the verge of empire. The language of liberty made their wars sound generous. The rhetoric of destiny made their generals sound divine. Patton's death coincided with the dawn of the Cold War, a conflict that elevated his ghost to strategic importance. His warnings about Soviet expansion were recast as prophecy. His desire to attack Russia became, retroactively, visionary. The nuance that he was also clinically unhinged quietly disappeared. In the mythology of containment, Patton became the man who saw it coming. Generals who might have denounced him in life now quoted him in congressional hearings. The United States, in the act of defining itself against totalitarianism, embraced a man who despised civilian restraint. It was a neat trick, and it worked for half a century. The irony, of course, is that Patton's philosophy was indistinguishable from the militarism America claimed to oppose. He believed in perpetual readiness, divine mission, and moral clarity enforced by artillery. Substitute a different flag, and the rhetoric becomes universal. In every empire, aggression is described as vigilance, conquest as self-defense. Patton's ghost would have been entirely at home in the Kremlin, provided the uniforms were stylish. Societies forgive their warriors anything if the war was won. Patton's cruelty toward subordinates, his slapping of shell-shocked soldiers, his insubordination, all were repackaged as eccentricities of genius. He was the necessary monster, the barbarian employed to protect civilization. This logic, once adopted, never leaves. It has justified everything from the Terror to Guantanamo Bay. Once a nation persuades itself that virtue requires violence, it will never again be short of volunteers. Napoleon enjoyed the same exemption. His invasions became defensive wars, his coups restorations of order. Even his failures were reinterpreted as noble tragedies. The psychology is universal. Nations prefer their villains victorious and their heroes complicated only after death. To admit otherwise would require humility, and humility has never built a monument. Both France and America maintain immaculate cemeteries for their fallen, but the neatness of the lawns is inversely proportional to the chaos of the causes. The rows of crosses in Normandy and the sarcophagus at Les Invalides perform the same function. They transform slaughter into symmetry. Clean marble is the most effective anesthetic ever devised. It tells visitors that whatever happened was necessary, and that those responsible have been forgiven by architecture. Patton's grave in Luxembourg is modest, but even there, the myth seeps through. His headstone stands apart from the others, positioned like a commander still reviewing his troops. Death, it seems, could not quite demote him. Visitors leave flags, coins, and quotations. Few leave questions. The cult of remembrance, when too carefully tended, becomes indistinguishable from idolatry. In the years following his death, Patton's warning about the Soviets metastasized into doctrine. The Patton option, to strike east before Stalin consolidated power, became a favorite parlor speculation among strategists who never had to reload a rifle. It was an elegant fantasy. One decisive campaign, a democratic Europe, and no Cold War. It ignored such trivialities as logistics, exhaustion, and the fact that the Allied armies were already muttering about demobilization. Even had the plan succeeded, it would have required the United States to adopt precisely the imperial posture it claimed to resist. Patton's dream of saving Europe would have destroyed the moral foundation of the alliance that liberated it. Yet the fantasy persists because it flatters the same instinct that made Patton famous: the belief that problems yield to force, if only one has the courage to apply enough of it. The 20th century was a long experiment in disproving that notion. The 21st shows little sign of learning. The Western world, heir to both Napoleon and Patton, remains addicted to the mythology of decisive men. It cannot resist the spectacle of the uniformed savior who promises to make history tidy again. Every generation produces its own echo. The field marshal who dreams of order, the politician who poses as a warrior, the corporation that markets war as precision. The tools evolve. The theology endures. Our drones are merely the latest cavalry. In this sense, Patton never died. He reappears whenever a government declares that freedom must be defended by preemptive strike. Whenever a leader confuses confidence with wisdom. Whenever victory is measured in shock and awe rather than understanding. The helmets have changed shape, but the rhetoric, clean, resolute, intoxicated by its own virtue, remains indistinguishable from his speeches. Imagine him now, pacing the corridors of some celestial headquarters, still dictating orders, still furious that the modern world insists on nuance. He would find our endless diplomacy contemptible, our moral fatigue incomprehensible. He would demand that we win something, anything, simply to feel alive again. In that sense, he is the perfect ghost for the modern West, eternally restless, perpetually armed, and mortally afraid of peace. His French counterpart waits beneath a dome of gold, equally restless, equally embalmed. Between them stretches 2 centuries of civilization that learned everything from their victories, except restraint. The emperor and the general, one baptized by revolution, the other by industry, are now the patron saints of nations that cannot decide whether they love freedom or simply the feeling of triumph. What remains of these men when the rhetoric fades? Napoleon left Europe more centralized, more bureaucratic, and less free. Patton left the United States more militarized, more arrogant, and less self-aware. Their legacies converge in a single lesson: that the instruments forged for liberation inevitably become tools of control. The cannon aimed at tyranny seldom forgets its trade once the tyrant is gone, and yet their ghosts remain useful. Politicians summon Patton to chastise softness, Napoleon to praise decisiveness. Military academies quote them selectively, stripping away the madness and leaving only the glamour. Every age needs its exemplars, and every exemplar must be simplified to fit the PowerPoint slide. Thus the machinery of amnesia keeps turning, lubricated by sentiment and funded by nostalgia. Perhaps this is why the French offered to bury Patton beside Napoleon, not to honor him, but to recognize him. They saw in his swagger the reflection of their own imperial adolescence. The gesture was an act of kinship among ghosts. The American declined, but the symbolism endures. Both nations continue to worship the same altar, the cult of the decisive man. and both remain baffled when history refuses to stay conquered. To visit Les Invalides is to stand before civilization's favorite contradiction: beauty built to commemorate destruction. To walk among the American graves at Ham is to confront the same contradiction in simpler marble. The lesson is identical in both languages. We forgive war not because it ends, but because we cannot live without its mythology.
When Patton's convoy crashed outside Mannheim, the world lost not a general, but an argument. His death spared him the humiliation of watching his creed dissolve into the cold arithmetic of deterrence. The atomic age rendered his valor obsolete. Heroism became a button, and victory a press release. Yet his ghost lingers, because it offers what technology cannot: the illusion of moral clarity. Napoleon had already learned that lesson on St. Helena, staring at the horizon of an empire reduced to memory. The sea around him was silent, as Europe would one day be, under the shadow of nuclear peace. Between their two deaths stretches the evolution of Western power, from the saber to the missile, from personal glory to bureaucratic annihilation. The rhetoric has changed. The temptation has not. If reincarnation exists, Patton is doubtless among us again, perhaps giving motivational speeches, perhaps drafting military budgets, perhaps selling resolve to frightened electorates. The uniform may be different, the medals fewer, but the expression is the same: certainty without comprehension. He thrives in every age that mistakes aggression for strength and confusion for cowardice. He is the ghost of a civilization that still believes. Violence, properly managed, is the highest form of order. And somewhere, beneath a dome of Parisian gold, Napoleon smiles. His empire, it seems, never ended. It merely changed its accent. Stay with us. More ghosts await. Subscribe.